Hi everyone, just give me a moment. We're trying to time ourselves here so that we don't get carried away and talk at you forever. Welcome back. After a brief respite, Professor Marchia, thank you still for being here today. And this is part 2 of our 5-part series on capitalist realism, leading up to part 5 on the media. I know some of you are there at the edge of your seats thinking, when are we going to talk about media? I thought this was a media sociology course, so we'll get there. So for now, we're going to finish talking about the realism part of capitalist realism, and we sort of started that with this quote that I'm going to repeat because I think it bears repeating in terms of understanding Fisher's perspective. The realism here is analogous to the deflationary perspective of a depressive who believes that any positive state, any hope, is a dangerous illusion. So we will start there. So with that in mind, Professor Marchia, what is capitalist realism?
Yeah, I mean, so we sort of started talking about it, but essentially, right, the idea that to be a realist about this thing is to know that there is no alternative to the way things are, right? That you can't change too much because change is going to lead to, all sorts of negative effects. So as bad as we see capitalism being, the idea that there could be some sort of other alternative system, right, is too risky. We have to be realists about it. We know that change would sort of inevitably lead to something bad, or it's impossible to do, right? It's just too embedded in the world and the way things are. It's impossible and tractable to change.
Right. And that, I mean, as somebody who has struggled with mental health issues in the past and depressive states, this metaphor of like when you are in that sort of a state, this idea of anything positive being a lie is something that I have personally experienced, and I'm sure other people have as well. Capitalism is that feeling, that horrible lie that, there is nothing better, there's no possibility for anything better at a scale of society and the world, right? That depression of society is capitalist realism, almost like it's the state where society is deeply sick and it needs to heal, because if not, we're going to doom ourselves almost to this really grim and violent reality that we live in, right? So that brings me to this famous quote from this book, but attributed to various people across space and time. This quote on page, what page is it in? The quote that it is easier to understand, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. It is in one of the early pages, and now I cannot find it, obviously. So, but let's talk about that. What is Mark Fisher saying? On page 6, he says that this sort of malaise happens at the level of the cultural unconscious. So let's unpack that a little bit. This idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism, and that this notion occurring at the level of the cultural unconscious. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So yeah, they quotes been attributed to different people. Jameson and Zizek, I believe, are the two that may have said it first, or at least popularized it. But it's sort of it's the way that we think about what's possible, right? So it seems even more likely to imagine something like climate change, right? Destroying the entire world. That seems more in the realm of possibility to us than the idea of economic change, right? Of the idea of some sort of different way of doing things. It actually seems, it's not only possible, it's very plausible, versus the idea of changing things is not only not plausible, but potentially impossible, right? And so it sort of draws into sharp relief the idea that, right, this thing that is very malleable, right, how we sort of organize society, the fact that we can't imagine that, but we could imagine something truly horrible happening, there's something sad about that, right? We could imagine, it's easier to imagine that children across the world will continue to starve indefinitely than to imagine being able to feed children across the world, right? It's easier to imagine that this will persist in a horrible state. We can't even imagine uh, fixing this in any way.
Yeah, and Fisher didn't unfortunately live to see this glorious year that we've all been gifted. And if we think about what has happened since the onset of COVID-19, suddenly and very dramatically, we had to reorganize in various ways. And of course, there's tension around this, right? There is a lot of interest in going back to work and going back to school so that the economy can continue to function. And there is a push for that. At the same time, there was a period of time suddenly, as if out of nowhere, for like 2 to 3 months, where everybody just had to like deal with the fact that the economy was going to be sort of put to the side for a little while, and we were going to try something new. And it just happened overnight, right? Everybody was down with the possibility of changing something when this external shock was placed upon us. But at the same time, we've had this external shock and external threat of climate change sort of looming in the horizon for a very long time. And that somehow, in that context, it was not possible to imagine dramatic shifts and changes in the way society operates. And I think that that's a very interesting thing. What do you think Mark Fisher would say about this transitional period of societies, so to speak?
Yeah, I think, looking at the contemporary moment, it's very interesting because, all these things that should be technically impossible, that if you had asked, people in power, leaders, different, uh, you know, uh, countries or sectors of society in the world, would it be possible to have uh, just huge amounts of the workforce not working, staying home, and to be provided for? They would say that's impossible, right? If you made some sort of different argument for why that might be necessary, right, they would say that's actually impossible. That cannot be the case. Then we see, right, if something happens like the pandemic, the coronavirus, suddenly it's actually possible to do, right? I mean, whether or not it could happen indefinitely, whether or not it could happen in different ways, right, is a different question. But suddenly what was possible changed overnight, right? There wasn't even a conversation about the fact that these things that should not be able to happen according to the logic of people in power were able to happen because we had to make it happen, right? It was a necessity. And
Yeah.
climate change is a similar thing. It is a necessity, but you still hear those same arguments that it's just not possible for us to just suddenly curb all the practices we're doing. That couldn't happen.
Yeah,
Right.
it's just not possible for everybody to stay at home instead of drive to the offices to curb carbon emissions. It's impossible. We cannot do that
Right.
until we can. And then that's what we do. And that's the new normal. And so this contemporary moment has really shown how society is totally malleable. We just like have been in this capitalist realist frame of mind where we were led to believe that it isn't, right? Like money is, I don't want to say not real. I don't want economists to come at me, but as soon as the economy collapsed in the US, $2 trillion were immediately, I don't want to say printed, but generated somehow to bail out corporations. And then some of it was used to bail out people minusculely. But the idea is that, like, for a country like the United States that sort of owns money and the monetary system, money is not an issue, and it never has been. And we've seen live evidence, right? This is like contemporary history we've all been alive for, that things that we are told are limitations are artificially placed, and that artificial limitation becomes our understanding of what reality is. That's capitalist realism, in a sense.
Yeah, which is something I think you see with the way the budget functions in America, right? Where you hear there's not money for these types of social services, right? The idea of healthcare for all, the idea of all these different initiatives that would help people, it's all of a sudden, well, where is that money going to come from? Then, let's say they want to go to, or in the Middle East in some place, all of a sudden budget is not a factor. We have trillions of dollars that are expendable. We can print it, we can borrow it. It's a non-issue, right? We all of a sudden, if we need the money, it's there.
Yeah, and that's why this economic force of capitalism sort of exist outside of the interests of people, right? Because it's this thing that is sort of self-commanding, self-governing, and self-generating at the will of capital itself, and not so much at the will of the people. And that disconnect is experienced in people's lived realities, and those lived realities are, we're going to talk about the mental health sections, those lived realities are harrowing and challenging, and we accept it because we are told that there's no alternative, right? So let's dig into the text a little bit. Page 15 I have here. I wanted to get your thoughts on page 15, students' book. Let's see. Where was I? Okay, page 15. What needs to be kept in mind is both that capitalism is a hyper abstract, impersonal structure, and that it would do nothing without our cooperation. The most Gothic description of capitalism is also the most accurate. Capital is an abstract parasite, an insatiable vampire and zombie maker, but the living flesh it converts into dead labor is ours, and the zombies it makes are us. What do you think of that powerful paragraph from Fisher?
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of sounding simplistic, like we money is really there ostensibly to facilitate humanity, right? But instead humanity is sort of under the control of how money functions and circulates, right? And so in that way, you know, if you think about what's structuring the world, right, if money is sort of at the top of the logic of how things have to be, everything's following the market, then we are like zombies, right? You know, what we can choose to do, what's available to us is subservient to something that's not, I mean, not real in a certain sense, right? I mean, I know money's real in a different sense, but in a certain sense, it's not real, right?
Yeah.
But we are subservient to the flow of capital in a way, right? And that you know, it makes us like zombies, right? Not humans. We're, you know, organizing our life around something that's you know, doesn't have any relationship to being human.
Yeah, it's made up. Society created it, right? So money is real. Obviously, money is real, and that's the reason things are the way they are. But in another truer sense, money isn't real because we made it up, right? At some point in history, we decided, all right, we need to organize society in a way that the most amount of people can get the most shared benefits from resources that are naturally occurring, right? Land to grow food, and just like land, that's where we started, land. And then people decided, okay, some of this land is going to be mine and I'm going to privatize it. And that sort of began this chain. So it's not a naturally occurring state. I mean, today, if you tell somebody that you want to privatize air, I feel like we'd be very confused by that idea. And at some point, I imagine privatizing land was similarly absurd, whereas now it's like the natural state of things. Private property is it, right? So in that sense, we are zombies because we're just following along into this concept of an economy that isn't naturally occurring in the same way air or land is. It's socially constructed to bring that concept into this. And then we're allowing that socially concept idea of money to determine. Mark Fisher goes on to like really talk about the levels of happiness and well-being that we have as individuals and the kind of society we live in. Like we're allowing our lived experiences to be determined by this idea of capital that was artificially generated by society. So I think that's a very important point that you made.
Right. If I could add, I think also like this ties into how the ideology works, because if you ask any one person, you know, is money real, right? Is money the thing that we all follow? Is money? They're going to say, no, I know money is just a social construction, right? I understand the value of life is, you know, has nothing to do with this material stuff. You know, money's made up, and people know that, right? If you ask any one person, they're going to say, of course I know that, but it doesn't function that way, right? Even though we know that is true, we still unconsciously behave as if it were true, right? We still follow this market logic, even if we're like, listen, I know it's all made up, right? I know money's not the point of life. I know that, you know, money's not this not the most important thing, it still functions that way in the real world.
Yeah, and it's because we don't have a choice. I mean, we need money to survive, right?
Right.
And like it's been become this force that sort of has an enormous amount of power over us. Even like for people like us that like think critically about concepts like the economy, we still participate in the economy. I have an Amazon account. I mean, I'm sitting here critiquing capitalism and I have robots deliver my packages from a corporation that is hoarding most of the world's resources because capitalism is water. We cannot escape it unless we explicitly, and this is the point of Fisher, unless we explicitly, first of all, acknowledge this is all, we're all in this, we're all in water. We need to step outside and look at water and evaluate water and think about how we might change the tides, right? That's and so it's not so much about the choices individuals make or about how we approach whatever like two-sided relationship we individually might have with the market, with the money. It's more about understanding that capital has created its own existence in a way that is pervasive. And I think like that kind of walks into the next part that I wanted to discuss in page 16. He's kind of tries to summarize capitalism as a pervasive atmosphere conditioning not only the production of culture, but also the regulation of work and education, and acting as kind of invisible barrier constraining thought and action. That's on page 16. What do you think of that?
Yeah. Right. So it obviously constrains our actions, right? I mean, that's sort of, I think everyone knows, everyone has bumped up more than likely against some sort of economic limitation.
Yes.
Right. But in terms of how it affects thought, right? I mean, again, the inability to sort of see it, right, also means that we sometimes reach conclusions that are a part of, having been so indoctrinated into the way things are, right? So sure, it means that we accept capitalism sort of uncritically because we don't see it, but also this means that a lot of our conclusions about how things can be stem from it, right? It is, as we're sort of saying, like water, right? How we approach every sort of problem actually is part of what influences that, is that, that pervasive, completely unconscious way that we buy into the way that markets work and the economy functions, right? And we're sort of hinting at the later part about mental health, right? But that's also something that's tied into it, right? Even how we approach this thing that seems very personal and individual, and maybe, and it is to some extent, right, biomedical, right? There's also a way in which this very pervasive thing that we take to be sort of natural law, the way that the economy functions, even creeps into that.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the idea of it operating at the level of the cultural unconscious, because it's not that anyone, any individual, I mean, certain institutions are obviously promoting it, but at the individual cultural level, it's not that anybody is explicitly engaging in capitalist realism. It's that we're all engaging with each other, and subconsciously within that engagement, within that cultural interaction, are the strong currents of capitalist realism that sort of drive and reinforce itself in this way that pervades through our culture, and media is a very important part of that, and we're going to get to that in a couple of videos from now. But I had a bunch of different notes here in relation to this, and we already talked about climate change, so let's see what we can do to wrap this up. I think, well, first I wanted to talk about this concept of the business ontology, in which it is simply obvious that everything in society, including healthcare and education, should be run as a business. What do you think of that, this business ontology idea?
Yeah. So it again just ties into what's taken for granted, which is that education is for profit, for example, or healthcare is for profit, at least in America, right? The idea that these are naturally in the domain of market forces, right? Education is not some sort of thing that we do for edification, right? It's a way of producing particular qualifications for a workforce. Is taken for granted as a given, right? I mean, even the idea of education for its own sake is sort of, even if you enjoy it, right, there's still this way that the market is a part of that, right? I mean, if you say I'm going to get a degree in creative writing because I love creative writing and I want to learn about it, well, people automatically will say, well, what are you going to do with that, right? And that's also part of because you invest so much money in it, right? It is run like a business, and so it's taken for granted. If it's run like a business, you need a return on investment with what you do with that.
Yeah, and you have to take a loan to go to college. So there's a whole other level of business. It's like gambling almost, right, on your future. So you take on this loan and then you have to make these choices that should result in some form of like positive employment that will be able to repay the loan you took, which is sort of a bet on your own success. And I hope that students that are at Davidson will have less of these issues, because we're obviously positioned to have a lot more opportunities than Stony Brook, right, where it's a big public university. A lot of students are working like 3 jobs and then coming into class, and we have these differences. And I hope that I don't want this to be this like discouraging idea about, what education is worth. And the reason we're talking to you about these unusual ideas is because we want you to think about your education in the most critical and contemporarily critical way possible, because you should be able to get more out of this than an economic exchange in an ideal world. And I hope that this will help you think about that. But in terms of the business ontology, I was also thinking like, gosh, we have a president that became president because he pushed the idea of running a country like a business. I mean,
Oh yeah.
that was and that's where we are. We
Is
are,
that what you okay.
no, we're living the business ontology. It is another water. It's a concentric circles of waters.
Right. I mean, also the idea that people heard that a country should be run like a business, right? The idea that the best way that I don't know if you want to call a country a community, but at some level, a society, okay.
Yeah.
The best way to run a society is like a business, right? The business is the ideal way of functioning for people is, right? I mean, there's something kind of sick about that, and the fact that people find that very appealing, that you know I'm not saying that it wasn't run like a business before, right? But the idea that
Right.
people were sort of like, finally, right, the
Yeah.
way that people should be interacting with each other, the way a country should place its values is based on Apple or Google, right? There's something actually very sad about that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and it's sad that that's something that speaks to people, and that goes to show how pervasive capitalist realism is, right? People want a country to be run like a business, even though it's automatically that is a point of contention, because a country is trying to provide, ostensibly, theoretically, in some ideal utopia that is
Right, supposedly, but
supposedly in some ideal utopia, a country exists to provide for the largest number of people in the most equitable way possible, whereas a business exists to provide the largest amount of money to the smallest number of people as possible. So how are you gonna, anyways, I mean, we could talk about this for days, but the point that we need to take away from here is that this idea of running everything like a business being normalized to the degree that it is in and of itself, like, it is what capitalist realism is. It's become a parasite that just sort of regenerates on all levels of society. So healthcare is a business, education is a business, a country is a business. And what happens when everything is a business? A small number of people win, and they accumulate a lot of capital, and the rest of the people are left wondering, what happened? What is going on? Why is my life that I have been given not fulfilling and meaningful? So that's a good transition to maybe talk about Fisher's, one of his main case studies in this book is about mental health. And so we will take a pause here unless you have any last thoughts, Professor Marchia.
we can move on.
Okay, let's we'll come back in a little bit with the next segment on mental health. All right.